I'm very glad to have back on Bad Faith podcast today, David Dayen. He is the executive editor of the American Prospect, and in my humble opinion, one of the most important voices with the institutional and political knowledge to really help us understand what's going on in the current political moment. One of the most important journalists on the left today. So welcome back. It's such a pleasure to have you again.
Quite an introduction. Thank you very much.
Well, look, I really mean it. I've been thinking about this a lot. As you know, the crisis in journalism continues to take its victims. And, with the struggles at The Intercept and so many people kind of ending up in Substack spaces, which are great and fine. And I don't have any critique of them at all. But I worry about the kind of diminishing power of newsrooms to do long-term investigative journalism. And I worry in particular about what it means for the left, because as an independent content creator myself, I know how much I rely on the reporting that comes out of people like yourself and David Sirota and Ryan Grimm and institutions like the American Prospect and the Intercept, and now the Lever. And I don't know, I just really want to always flag how essential you guys are, even if there's listeners who might, be consuming, Majority Reporter, Kyle Kalinske, or whatever it is, whatever like the independent left media creators are, all of the news is still coming from the news,
right.
And it's not,
right.
The New York Times. And we cover what's being printed in the Times often critically, but the kinds of stories we want to be talking about are coming from folks like you.
Well, I appreciate it. I mean, one of the reasons, I, over the last 5 years, haven't really gone to sort of an independent Substack kind of place is that I think these institutions are important, and I wanted to build them with a vision for, trying to do something different than other people, really focusing on power, who has it, and what they're doing with it. And so that's really the project. And, we soldier on.
Yeah, well, that's exactly why I wanted to talk to you today, because this is how I see it. A lot of the kind of left criticism and skepticism about what a Harris-Waltz administration will look like has been focused on, understandably so, the ongoing genocide in Gaza and whether or not Harris will have a legitimate break, like a real break from the ongoing Biden-Harris administration's policy there, or whether or not she will have a softer tone without any real change in America's posture toward Israel. But there are other things going on as well. And I do think that in a different sort of political environment, there would be as much criticism, or at least skepticism, I should say, about whether or not we are going to get a Kamala Harris administration that is to the left of Joe Biden's, or if it's similarly going to be one of these tone issues where she seems softer because of the way she talks about issues, or there is a presumption that she will be better on X, Y, and Z issue because she is a Black and Indian woman, et cetera. And so I wanted to talk to you because you just wrote this really compelling piece in the American Prospect called Why Tony West Matters. And for those who might not know, Tony West is both Kamala Harris's brother-in-law. He was also, number 3 in the Obama DOJ. And he has now come onto the Kamala campaign as an unpaid advisor. So how about, now that I've set this up, you tell us why Tony West and his proximity to the Kamala Harris campaign and potential administration might matter.
So just to step back, by virtue of how Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee, she didn't have a primary at all. And by virtue of the trajectory of Kamala Harris's career, she was vice president and didn't seem to have much of a policy role there. Prior to that, she was senator from California. Her tenure was entirely during the Trump administration, a time when Democrats were in the minority for that entire period in the Senate. So she had no kind of ability to make policy there. As Attorney General, most of her Most of her successes were through multi-state litigation where she was working with other attorneys general. She very rarely stepped out on her own. So we know less about this candidate's views, her beliefs, where she wants to take the country, than probably any candidate for president in the last 80 years. So for that reason, we have to sort of sift through the tea leaves. We have to figure out through inference what is going to be done. Her speeches thus far have been kind of standard normie Dem stump speeches. They don't go into a whole lot of detail. Apparently, this Friday, there's going to be a speech on the economy. It's kind of her first policy speech, so we'll get a little bit more understanding there. But one of the things that we have to go on is who her advisors are. Who are the people she trusts? Who are the people she listens to? And it's certainly clear that one of them is Tony West. I mean, Tony West apparently was in the room on the day that Kamala Harris learned that Joe Biden was going to step down from the presidential race. He was calling people along with Harris on that first day to round up support. He is apparently a liaison to the business community. One thing you missed in his resume is that he immediately went from the Justice Department, first to Pepsi, I believe, and now is the chief legal officer of Uber. And in that role, Uber is actually part of a coalition suing the Labor Department, the Biden-Harris administration's Labor Department, over their independent contractor rule, which says that, whether or not workers are employees or just independent contractors. So this is someone who is actually in his professional capacity suing the administration of whose the vice president is, he's an advisor to the vice president, and he's suing the administration she's vice president of. So it's a bit of an unusual situation. So, but what I wrote about in that piece, in terms of why he matters, there's sort of I wouldn't call it a myth, but there's kind of a paint with a broad brush toward people on the left that all we care about is, well, if you work for Uber, you must be bad. Or if you work for Goldman Sachs, if you work for one of these other places, it must be, it's called the revolving door. If you've ever spun through the revolving door, you need to be shut out of policymaking forever. And what I say to that is that we actually have to look at what Tony West did when he was in government, the first time through the revolving door. And if you look at that, it's actually a really kind of a shameful record, if you ask me. So Tony West was at the Justice Department during the Obama administration. And this was during a time after the financial crisis when there were a lot of investigations into the banking industry for what they did to precipitate the financial crisis. In particular, there were allegations that they committed a number of instances of fraud, both in the packaging and selling of mortgage securities, and also in the foreclosure process, where they kind of lost the chain. I read a whole book about this in 2016. There's a book called Chain of Title. They lost the ability to prove that they owned the underlying loans. So they fabricated documents on a mass scale, talking about millions of documents, to throw millions of people out of their homes with false evidence that was presented in courts and county recording offices. And there was this large investigation that went on in 2010, because at the end of 2010, thanks to basically citizen journalists who were foreclosure victims who looked at their own paperwork and saw discrepancies, the biggest banks in America could no longer foreclose on anyone because they couldn't do it anymore legally. And so a bunch of investigations started at that point. And unfortunately, they mostly moved from the investigation phase to the settlement phase almost immediately. And Tony West was at the heart of that. He was the figure in the Justice Department that was doing the settlements with the big banks. And it was in conjunction with all 50 state attorney generals. And at that time, Kamala Harris was one of those state attorney generals. So this drags through 2011. Some Democratic AGs break from this 50 state investigation. They say Tony West and others at the Justice Department are putting too much pressure on them to settle on the cheap. It's mainly like Beau Biden, who's Joe Biden's son, he passed away, but he was the Attorney General of Delaware. Eric Schneiderman was the Attorney General of New York. They break away. They try to encourage other AGs to break away. Eventually, they get Kamala Harris to do so after a pressure campaign that included Gavin Newsom, who was the lieutenant general, governor at the time, and her biggest political rival in California. They actually get him to sign this letter saying, we need a fair settlement. And so Harris very reluctantly breaks away, including breaking away from her own brother-in-law, right? And so she breaks away from the settlement. If you can't get California in the settlement, you don't have one. It's the biggest state, and it was the biggest state for foreclosures at that time. So that's what happens in the kind of the fall of 2011. But slowly but surely, more pressure is placed to just settle. And all of those AGs come back for a very weak settlement. When they went away, it was going to be $20 billion. These are nominal figures. The whole point was to get a big headline number and say, I did a settlement for the X amount of dollars. They left, it was 20 billion. They came back, it was 25. Not that much more, especially when you're talking about the biggest banks in America. And it wasn't a real number. That's the important thing. It was based on consumer relief credits, where they would get credit for doing something. And some of the things they got credit for were bulldozing homes, giving up second loans that were unrecoverable, and just there was no way to actually get the money back anyway. They would, modify investor-owned loans that the banks didn't even own, paying basically with other people's money. There are a whole host of these consumer credits. The point is that most of them were not the sustainable type of loan modification that would keep people in their homes. As a result, 10 million families, basically an entire generation, lost their homes after the financial crisis to foreclosure. And Tony West was kind of the architect of that. So if you look at someone who didn't want to go up against power, who decided to settle on the cheap, there was allegedly a task force that was supposed to do criminal charges. It ended up never even having phones or an office. It was a repository for press releases of existing cases. It never did any investigation. We had this lack of accountability in the Obama administration for the perpetrators of the Great Recession. And Tony West was a major cog in that. And that's basically the point that I make.
So first off, I'm so appreciative of you being so focused, both in the past and in your 2016 book, but through the present, in continuing to center and highlight how sort of radicalizing and traumatizing the 2008 housing crisis was, and how it in many ways was the, not villain origin story, but I would argue hero origin story of so many left movements that emerged since then, from Occupy Wall Street, in the ways that was fed into and co-opted by the kind of Obama era, and then, redirected into the Bernie movements. And now here we are, sort of with confusing places to go, maybe no place to go. But I want to drill down on this a little bit, because as you've just described what happened, some listeners might be thinking, well, what is the takeaway here? Because the narrative you described has Kamala Harris in a position where she ultimately ostensibly did the right thing, whether it's because she caved to political pressure, only did so because she needed to be competitive as a sort of leftist competing in California, and putting that in quotation marks for people who aren't watching, against Gavin Newsom, who are both trying to claim a certain kind of mantle. Would she have done the right thing in the first place? Did Gavin Newsom even really care? Was this an optics battle? Did none of it really matter? Because ultimately it was all to be able to claim a marginally larger settlement number from the banks that wasn't meaningful reform for the thousands of people who were kicked out of their homes. Yeah, okay.
That one. None of it mattered.
None of it mattered.
Kamala Harris was no better than any other attorney general who ended up, rubber stamping this week's settlement. She was also no worse. Let's be very clear. There were no heroes in government during this time. To the extent that she did marginally better, it's because she got her own monitor for the settlement in California, and she hired a woman named Katie Porter, who became the monitor for that settlement. And Katie Porter actually was fairly tenacious, and 40% of principal reductions, which are the most sustainable type of relief, were actually in California. So it was worse elsewhere, but she sort of made the best of a bad deal. And Porter had a lot to do with that. But, she was no better and no worse. The point is that West was a real architect here. And what I want to say is that, often presidents have these crisis moments, these moments of opportunity and crisis that they can really forge a new direction. And for the Obama administration, it was the foreclosure crisis and ultimately the foreclosure fraud crisis, which was an opportunity to reallocate the losses in the system from the Great Recession so that homeowners didn't bear all of them. They could have equalized it and made banks actually pay some of the price here, and they didn't. And those crisis moments sort of reveal something about people, right? And it revealed something about the Obama administration. It revealed something about Tony West. And, the fact that he's an advisor to Kamala Harris means that the next time there's one of those moments, that's what I'm looking towards as evidence as to what a Harris administration might do.
So Matt Iglesias recently wrote this piece in his Substack that's arguing that what we're sort of doing here, trying to read the tea leaves into what her administration might be like, by looking at the people that she is surrounding herself, who she's hiring for her campaign, who her advisors are, and what they've been doing with their lives, is some combination of unfair and wrong, because we should actually like the fact that she has people who are experienced in these various industries coming within her orbit. His piece is called "Bring Back the Revolving Door." What do you make of this argument that I think not a lot of listeners to this show, but people out in the world might think it's unfair? You're a successful person, you're going to go to the top of your industry, and that's going to mean working for the most successful companies in America, and those are going to be companies like Amazon and companies like Facebook and companies like Uber. What do you want? Her not to have any talent around her? What do you say to that argument?
I think there are a lot of places that you can find talent. The idea that the only successful people in America are the only smart people or the only willing people to have the requisite experience to serve in government are found on Wall Street and Silicon Valley is frankly ridiculous. There are, and it's borne out by events. We have, there's no special kind of sauce that is given to you through the prism of private enterprise. If that was all true, then we should all be clamoring for Bill Ackman, who's now spouting conspiracy theories on Twitter. He's a successful guy, right? I mean, maybe he should be the Treasury Secretary or something. So it's a silly argument. We have seen the more successful folks in the Biden administration, frankly, come from public service, come from the think tank world, come from academia, and come through the ranks of policymaking, which is literally the requisite experience that you need to make good policy, is that you are in a policymaking position. By contrast, if you look at the entire foreign policy team of the Biden administration, they all come out of this boutique consulting firm called West Exec Advisors, which was working for defense companies, which was working for tech companies, which was working for large corporations. So, I think if you judge the Biden domestic policy, particularly around consumer protection and antitrust, against the Biden foreign policy, which I know you have strong views about, and you look at exactly where they came from, I think it becomes clear that the idea that you have to hone your skills in the private sector before you can have a public sector job is just an absurd notion.
Yeah, I mean, one of your colleagues or a couple of your colleagues at the American Prospect wrote a piece directly sort of addressing this notion of Max Morin and Henry Burke. And they point out in their piece from August 13th that at least one of the individuals that Iglesias was kind of hand-wringing about, who the leftists pushed back on, was like substantively not qualified for the position because they worked in like a different kind of financial instrument. But the idea that they were kind of successful and worked at one of these kind of shiny places was presumptively it was just assumed that they could handle basically any kind of financial instrument that was germane to the government job in question. So I think that's an important point. I do want to drill down on this a little bit because I do think there are people who are going to need a level of more like concrete specificity before they're willing to say, okay, you worked at Uber and therefore you're going to be a bad influence. I think precisely because there is this professional managerial class who knows a lot of people who work at these industries. And I'm thinking about myself in some ways because, you know, when you go to a certain kind of school, they are actively recruiting all of you to go and do exactly those kinds of jobs. You know, all of the consulting firms are coming and recruiting heavy on campus. Everybody I basically knew from college, if they were quote unquote successful, went off to work for an institution like Bain or Facebook or, one of these big Lehman Brothers, LOL. That didn't work out so well for some of them, but, most of them landed on their feet. Right. And many people kind of saw the light and left after a few years or left because, it's just really tough working conditions and long hours and they want to start families or whatever and are no longer around, even if it wasn't a political choice. But some other people either are still there or because they have worked there once or knew people that worked there once, hesitate to say, well, it's necessarily that he's a bad or evil person or that he's going to be pushing bad policy. So I wonder if you could speak perhaps to some of the more, I think, substantive choices that he's made in these roles, the arguments that he has been having to make or choosing to make on behalf of Uber, particularly in the context of the kind of contract employment conversation that's been going on in California, and anything else I might not be, I might not know about myself.
I mean, here's what I would say. You have to look at somebody's record. I mean, it's not enough to just sort of say person A worked at place B and therefore we're going to reject that person. There are examples of people like you just described who, started their career in the private sector and then went into policymaking and has done a great job. I'll give you a perfect example, which is Rohit Chopra. Rohit Chopra is the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. In my view, has done an excellent job there, cracking down on financial scams. He started his career for the first year of his post-college life at McKinsey as a consultant, and he left. And he's even told me I learned things about how the other side operates at McKinsey, actually. And it helps me in understanding that mindset and understanding the kinds of things that I see when I'm trying to protect consumers. So it really is about your record. And if you talk about Tony West and his record, that's why I focus on his record in government, right? But you could also talk about his record at Uber, where, in California, we passed a law. It was called AB5 that said that essentially it said the workers at rideshare companies like Uber are actually employees because they take all their information and direction from Uber. They're paid by Uber. They're using, they have no sort of independent way of managing their time necessarily. And so they're employees. And Uber, with Tony West being fully involved in this, spent $200 million to pass an initiative. It wasn't just Uber that spent that, but it was Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, all of these rideshare companies. They were the main contributors to this, spent $200 million passing an initiative that essentially nullified that law and said that Uber drivers and other rideshare drivers, gig economy workers, are independent contractors, not available to get benefits. They sort of shaded the truth about this and said that this would give those workers a minimum wage. People who have looked at it, like researchers at UC Berkeley, show that it's it's below the California minimum wage, and in some cases below the U.S. minimum wage, what these Uber drivers are getting now. And so he engineered that while he was at Uber. Not a good look for labor rights necessarily. And he's done some other things, brokering with other states around the country to try to stop them from, trying to do right by rideshare drivers and gig economy workers. So you have to really look at the record. Is my point, and it usually becomes pretty clear who's on the side of working people and who's on the side of big business.
So, David, you actually kind of jokingly a couple of questions ago raised the prospect of Bill Ackman wanting to be Treasury Secretary, but as we played I think last week's episode, sorry, what did I call him?
No, you just ran it together. I didn't know you were talking about.
Oh, sorry, Bill Ackman, yes.
Yeah.
So as people know from last week's episode, there was a clip on CNBC, I believe, of the host and the guest kind of openly ruminating about who could basically purchase that spot. And they put forward Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan, as the one who could potentially be in that slot, which is particularly galling given that Donald Trump has also suggested that Jamie Dimon would be good for that position.
Treasury Secretary in a Harris administration. Who is it?
Who's closest to buying it?
Who's closest? Well, the people leading the charge on Wall Street, you have Ray McGuire, you have Blair Efron, you have
they're the major donors.
Yeah, and they're really putting themselves front and center. But who she chooses remains to be seen. Jamie Dimon's name is always floated.
Here's what I'm going to say.
Who do you think?
And I think it's a good example of how, when it comes to our broad economic financial future as a country, there is very little air between the left and the right in terms of how they staff their administrations. I want to give you a chance to respond to that clip.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, CNBC has been amazing in this short era since Kamala Harris has become the nominee. It's become kind of a must watch because everyone kind of doesn't know what Kamala Harris is going to do. Everyone's kind of projecting their wishes and, projecting their hopes and dreams on there. And that includes the private sector. It includes industry. And they're taking to CNBC to kind of make their pitch to Kamala Harris to I don't want to say come to the dark side, but to basically align with the business community once again. And there's been one flashpoint in this, and that is Lena Khan. Lena Khan is the head of the Federal Trade Commission. She's worked in government. She was a professor at Columbia University. She was a law student before that. And she's the youngest chair of the Federal Trade Commission, really aggressive antitrust enforcer, aggressive on consumer protection. And there have been multiple instances, mostly on CNBC, where CEOs and executives have come out and flat out explicitly said, I think Kamala Harris should fire Lena Khan.
I am against breaking principles, and I am against being radical. The Lena Khan lady, she's a total radical, right? She's not respected by her staff. She's She's a bully. She's randomly stopping deals. She's trying to apply theories that the courts have consistently struck down. She's going to companies like Axon, which makes Taser, and for a tiny little under 10 million acquisition that worked out, trying to make them clone their entire company. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's this totally anti-capitalist, totally against companies in general.
And they've done it multiple times on CNBC, which is CNBC almost has this like stock question that they ask everyone on who comes on their network. What do you think Kamala Harris should do about Lena Khan? It's been really revealing to see the kinds of conversations that usually happen behind closed doors happening on television, on CNBC. Usually, you'll get the influence campaign happening from an executive talking to an aide, maybe a Tony West, an aide to the candidate, and saying, this is what you should do. This is, and obviously a lot of these people are also donors to Kamala Harris, so they have her ear anyway. But seeing it so explicit, and there's one fascinating CNBC interview with a guy named Roger Altman, who's like an old Wall Street graybeard. And he's asked about this, and he says, well, I don't think it's good for people to be saying it in public because it's going to make it much harder. It's going to make it much harder for her to do that because she's going to look like she's kowtowing to donors.
Well, first, I think that the antitrust regime under President Biden has been too extreme. Maybe we did need a correction because there were certain things that were allowed to go forth in earlier years, the Trump years, which I might not, for example, have favored from a competition policy point of view. Whether President Harris, if she achieves that, makes a change, Andrew, I don't know. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me because there's so much controversy over Jonathan Kanter and Lina Khan, but I wouldn't expect that change right out of the gate. And I'm not sure whether it would be made or it wouldn't. If I were, one of the high-profile, for example, Silicon Valley types who are clamoring publicly for Lena Khan's head, honestly, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that because it fires up the progressives. You then have a tug of war between the progressives and those who want a change, and it's not constructive.
And like the fact that he had to say that out loud is just so fascinating that he's like, there's a right way and wrong way to do this, you idiots. You don't say out loud, fire Lena Khan, because she's not going to be able to now fire Lena Khan. He's like, you ruined everything, Yeah,
that's really incredible. So I gotta ask, I mean, is it cynical of me? Is it cynical of me to think, well, maybe they feel like they can say this out loud with impunity because they in fact do have impunity, that our political posture right now is so polarized. I think well-founded concerns about what it means for Donald Trump to be back on the White House are so dominant in the decision-making tree of people who are voting for Democrats that there's never going to be a real conversation about, well, I guess I'm going to withhold my vote for Joe Biden until he affirms, or for Kamala Harris until she affirms that she's not going to fire Lena Khan.
Right.
I can't even really care anything at all about antitrust or financial policy or anything like that because at the end of the day, I got to defeat Trump. I mean, is that too cynical of me to suggest that if there can barely be a conversation about what Harris owes the public over a genocide, that certainly no one needs to be afraid about being open and honest about their attempts to buy our financial system in a Kamala Harris administration?
I would never accuse you of being cynical, Brianna. I just would never do that. I actually heard that directly. I went to a Harris rally to cover it in Las Vegas just over the weekend. And I talked to people who were in the crowd. And I said, what priorities do you want to see in Kamala Harris? What excites you about her? And I asked this one woman and she said, I wish I could care about the important matters that are facing the country. But, this is a red alert. We have to oppose Trump, et cetera. So I heard almost exactly what you're saying from someone in the crowd. And however, I will give you I will leaven the cynicism a little bit by saying this.
Okay.
Since this call was made, and the first person to explicitly say I think you should fire Lina Khan was a guy named Reid Hoffman.
Lina Khan is a person who is not helping America in her job and what she's doing, and so I would hope that Vice President Harris would replace her.
Reid Hoffman is the co-founder of LinkedIn. He was the head. He's on the board of Microsoft, which bought LinkedIn at one point. He's under investigation by the FTC, by the way. So small wonder that he wants Lina Khan fired. And a lot of times that's not said publicly when talking about this. But his a company that he funded was then bought up by Microsoft in kind of an illegal way, and the FTC is investigating that. So big wonder that guy wants Lina Khan fired, right? So since that happened, though, we've seen it mostly, maybe not from voters, but from people in the coalition, the Democratic coalition. So I'm talking about labor unions. I'm talking about progressive organizations. I'm talking about members of Congress, not just the Bernies of the world, but members of Congress in tough races in swing states, people like Senator Jackie Rosen from Nevada, all of a sudden showing pictures of themselves on Twitter taking meetings with Lina Khan and saying she's really important to me, and we're fighting for the same agenda. So if Kamala Harris thinks that she can basically disavow some of the work that was done by Biden, some of the good work that was done by Biden to reinvigorate antitrust enforcement, to reinvigorate some of the consumer protection angles, she's going to have a problem with her own coalition within the Democratic Party. That's what that signaled.
I hear that, but here's what I'm thinking. Rosen, Nevada, huge union state, the culinary union kind of breaking ranks with leadership and coming out for Bernie in 2020 was huge for him, instrumental in him winning the state with 70% of the Latino vote. Okay. I could understand why he might feel, because of the domestic pressures in his state, a desire to distance from distancing herself from the anti-Lena Khan
and if she was the only one, I would say that. But we're talking about across the board. There's been kind of a rallying to Lena Khan very organically from all sectors of the party, not just the left, but some people in the center as well. Rosen is pretty much a centrist Democrat.
But my concern, though, is we kind of started this conversation talking about how Beau Biden kind of saber rattled about wanting to have a more left, more progressive, more, people friendly position, hostile adversarial against the banks, and corralled everybody else to get on his side, all for what ended up being a sort of performative marginal increase on a settlement amount for the banks. And so I do continue to have this cynicism, this skepticism that this is anything more than just, kind of signaling without any real leverage, because at the end of the day, what are these Democratic leaders around the country going to do? Say, we're going to withhold support for Kamala Harris as president of the United States as she's running against Donald Trump because Lina Khan? I mean, it does feel to me like if there's no red line in one instance, there's no red line anywhere. Vote blue no matter who. This is the sort of perniciousness of it. I get framed sometimes as being indifferent to what it means if Trump wins. But what it's very clear to me is that if you are unwilling at any point in time, especially over the big issues, like I'd say a genocide, to say that there are any conditions to your vote, what you end up is with a Democratic Party that feels like it can move through politics with absolute impunity and get to a place where you have open bids for who gets to be the Treasury Secretary on CNBC.
Right. It's definitely a difficult scenario. Obviously, the nature of how this all came about means that Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee without having to make any commitments to anybody, and really without having a fully formed agenda of her own. And so that is a difficult scenario, particularly for Democrats who want to see themselves, have power in the institution. One thing I would say is that if you actually listen to the stump speech of Kamala Harris, and you actually hear her talk about things that she has done, like things in her record, and particularly the record of the last 4 years, the record of the vice president while she was vice president. It's all things that come from the Lena Khan faction of the party, right? I mean, what I think there's maybe a recognition of is that if you actually want to get things done that people like and care about, and things that give you a record that you can tout and say that you've actually done work for the American people, you have to go to the people that are actually competent enough in government to do things that are successful. And those people are people like Rohit Chopra and people like Lina Khan and people like Jennifer Abruzzo at the National Labor Relations Board. Presidencies are huge. There's no one faction of a presidency, right? Particularly in this Biden presidency, you have, the foreign policy faction, which came out of, corporate consulting and has, shown itself for what it is. There's people like Janet Yellen and Gina Raimondo, which are kind of normie corporate Democrats. And then there's this other faction that Biden allowed into the coalition that is much stronger on worker protections, much stronger on consumer protections, much stronger on breaking up giant concentrations of power. And that's now part of the coalition. Right. And it's going to be harder. I'm not saying it's impossible. I think this all is going to be a fight and a jump ball. And that's why we're looking at all information that we can get to try to figure out what Kamala Harris is going to do.
Okay, so speaking of looking at all information, let's go to what we know. Because again, this is all reading the tea leaves well enough. Yeah. That's fine. There was another CNBC clip that I saw Matt Stoller highlight with Maryland Governor Westmore, close ally. He's describing him as a close ally of Kamala Harris, asked about what Kamala Harris will do about antitrust regulation.
There have been a lot of calls from the donor class specifically on Harris to potentially move away, if you will, from Lena Khan, for example, and to try to have a different type of regulatory regime that might be more open to transactions and deal making and other things like that. Do you think that we are going to hear about a shift in terms of her regulatory views, and do they really differ from President Biden?
I think we will, and I think we have to. And I think, making sure that we have a regulatory body that's able to have and influence free markets, that is able to have and influence real capital and liquidity flow, making sure that we are both supporting our small businesses and making it easier for small businesses to be able to grow, and also making it easier for our large industries to be able to compete within our states and within this country, is something that I think is going to be important. And I think that it is important for people to remember, too, that as the vice president is thinking about a future-facing administration, that there are going to be different dynamics that are going to require different philosophies. There will be different socio-political and just political dynamics that is going to require a different set of a vision, a different lens and a different vision. And I think that's what the vice president is going to be able to offer. This is not just going to be how are we speaking about the work of the Biden-Harris administration. This is going to be about what is going to be the impact and the hope of the Harris-Waltz administration, which I do think will have some differences with what we're seeing within the Biden-Harris administration.
What do you take from that, David?
I mean, first of all, it's saying a lot of words to say nothing. Like it's just such gobbledygook. And Westmore is hiding the ball, right? I mean, he was an investment banker. And he's now the governor of Maryland, where there are certainly other governors out there that have gotten a lot more done with smaller majorities than Westmore has in Maryland. But it's concerning. And we reached out to Westmore's gubernatorial office and asked what he actually meant by that, because a lot of it was very obscure, and he didn't say anything. Ryan Grimm also reached out to him and got an answer that was even stranger. It just said, the Biden-Harris administration has been really good on consumer protection. And Ryan was like, is that a response? Is that a response to the question I actually just asked you? And they said yes. It made no sense, right? But I'm definitely concerned about it. I also have seen over the last couple days that Harris has brought in people from the Biden administration who were actually instrumental in getting Lena Khan hired. People like Bharat Ramamurthy, who was the chief deputy of the National Economic Council, and the head of the Economic Council, Brian Deese. So, they used to talk about the Obama administration in this term that was from an old book about Lincoln called Team of Rivals, right? Do you remember that whole thing?
I do.
It was in Obama, it was not true at all. Like there was this lie that oh yeah, these people don't like each other and they're a team of rivals. There was a lot of continuity in the Obama administration, right? But this kind of thing, I think she's being pulled in a lot of directions, and I think she's being pulled in a lot of directions because she has not sort of established herself with I don't want to say moral, but she hasn't established herself with this kind of a policy center. And so she's being pulled by, there's definitely a corporate faction that has her ear. And, in recent days, she's hired people who came out of the successful stuff in the Biden administration that has her ear. We don't know to what extent. We don't know what she's ultimately going to listen to. We are going to get a speech on economic policy on Friday. That's going to tell us a little bit more. She hasn't sat for an interview with any press. Maybe she'll do that. There's no policy positions on her website. Maybe we'll get those at some point. I do think that if you're going to give your vote to somebody, you might want to know what they stand for. And so I don't think it's tenable for her to rope-a-dope her way throughout the entire presidential campaign. It might be tenable to the Democratic base who's going to vote for a Democratic ticket anyway, but she actually needs some people who are in the, who are undecided, and those people actually might want to know what she wants to do. So I hope we're going to get some more clarity there. I think she's going to be able to rope-a-dope her way on some of this stuff, hopefully not everything.
Yeah, it's interesting because, at least, prior to October 7th, when that became a real, hot, central red line for folks that changed the dynamics, people in my own left community who I really like and respect, like, Crystal Ball, really looked at Biden's labor policy and the Lena Khan appointment in particular, as well, as evidence for why, despite disappointments in Biden's administration overall, it was worth it to go ahead and vote for him over, let's say, a third-party candidate. And while I disagreed with that position, I thought it was a legitimate one, right? And so for the highlights of his administration, even for people who have been very, very significant critics of him on the left, to potentially be on the chopping block, I think should be big news. And I will also say, it's entirely possible that the reason Westmore and any other Kamala surrogate might be offering up these wishy-washy non-answers could be because they do like Lena Khan and want to keep Lena Khan, but don't want to incur the wrath of this donor class that does not like Lena Khan.
I think it's the other way. I think they don't like Lena Khan. They don't really want her around, but they don't want to incur the wrath of Democrats of the left.
But that's the problem, that, I was trying to be good faith here and say, well, it might be that she's super duper a good guy and just wants to win the election because, that is the argument that gets made in so many contexts. Oh, just get her in office and we can push her then. How many times did we hear that about Biden? Just let him get into office and we should push him then. I remember being critical of Biden back in 2020 on a whole host of issues, wondering why, let's say, the Sunrise Movement, which had given him like an F or whatever ranking in the Democratic primary, immediately endorsed him in the general election without trying to get any more additional concessions. And they have become more radical in their approach after that. And I think in a way, this is really positive because they learned from that experience. I remember sitting with Katie Halper, live streaming into the wee hours of the morning, talking about the defense of people like Lloyd Austin, when we were pointing out, oh my God, talk about a revolving door. They want a defense secretary who previously worked for Raytheon.
Who's
Are we
on the
not
board,
concerned
yeah.
about the perverse incentives for warmongering? And here we are in the middle of 2 new wars. And so in the defense of him, by the way, at the time was, how dare you critique a Black cabinet member? You're doing a racism. And so when I look at Tony West and I look at Westmore,
you don't hear that about the woman of color, Lina Khan. Like it's funny. Right. There are kind of two antitrust enforcers in the government right now. One is Lina Khan, and the other is a guy named Jonathan Cantor, who just successfully finished a case that found Google to be a monopolist, right? So you'd think they'd be really worried about Jonathan Cantor, the white guy. But for some reason, they're going after the woman of color, Lina Khan. But no, you're absolutely right, and certainly identity politics does get used as a shield often in these moments when it's convenient. It's just funny when the tables are turned, they who they go after. But yeah, I mean, I would say that in that case. We did have a unity task force. Biden did sort of say, okay, and part of this was because he had no apparatus of policy within his campaign at all. He kind of had to borrow it from the Sanders and Warren campaigns because he didn't have one. So he did sort of say, okay, this is a faction that had got millions of votes. We're going to incorporate some of that into our administration. Not all of it, but, in certain areas. And I think that's borne out. I mean, I think they did in certain places. Harris does not. There's no unity task force going on. There's no policy task force at all going on. She's trying to kind of skate through and say, yeah, I was Biden's vice president, and Trump sucks, and here we go. And I'm going to do normie Dem things. She said, around abortion, around other things, and also I'm going to play up, border security, and I'm going to, do all of those things. So it's just much less contingent, right? There isn't this sort of months-long process that there was in the Biden administration of saying, okay, we're going to put together a framework that is broadly acceptable to all facets of the Democratic Party to the extent we can. That's what was done by Biden, because he's kind of a party man and he just wants to be in the center of wherever the party is. And if the party was a neoliberal party, he'll be a neoliberal. And if the party is more left, he'll go more left.
Yes, but David, and I think there's something else going on here.
I'm talking mostly domestic policy here, by the way. I'm not talking about the foreign policy stuff. But
but also, and I think this point was made by some American Prospect journalists. Let me see. Harold Meyerson wrote this in his piece. There are some damned good reasons why Joe Biden moved to the left. And he wrote that piece in response to Jonathan Chait, who was basically arguing that Biden was wrong and dumb to have done a unity task force and to have joined up with Joe Biden, the Bernie Sanders folks. And one of the reasons that Harold Meyerson points out that, actually it was a good idea for Joe Biden is not just because of vibes and because he just, wanted to be a consensus builder or something, but because Bernie had run a two primaries in which he was much more successful than most people anticipated that he would be. And he had this huge coalition behind him that wasn't necessarily going to fall in line. And so I can't help but notice this time around when the Democratic Party shut down the primary, you had mouthpieces like Simone Sanders coming out on TV and saying there will be no primary. That same sense of leverage doesn't exist because there isn't someone with a mass movement behind them that they can ostensibly direct into other political avenues outside of the Democratic Party, if they so want it.
I don't disagree. And, I think there are a lot of people out there who are wishing and hoping and saying, well, she was Biden's vice president. She's probably just going to do what Biden did. And she's signaling that, no, she wants to be her own person. Biden's unpopular, by the way, so she wants to disassociate with him in certain aspects. And it's a real jump ball. And the leverage, you're right, the leverage isn't there, except for the fact that at some point you do have to govern. And what I think we saw, if if you look at Obama's midterms, if you look at the ways in which anytime it wasn't the words Barack Obama on the ballot, he lost massive amounts of votes for the Democratic Party. And ultimately, his replacement was Donald Trump. That these policies, if you're not personally popular, if you're not, if you don't have the personal charisma to withstand that, they're bad for the kind of policies that I want and that I think most of us want. So I think that it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a kind of a nonstop fight to see who's going to get the new cabinet positions, what things are going to be prioritized in the early days. If she wins, right? I mean, Trump could easily win, by the way.
Right.
But if she wins, stipulating that if she wins, it's going to be a fight to see where she's going to go. And there isn't as much leverage as there was in a Biden administration. I think we should be honest about that. And to the extent that there needs to be organizations, people, and journalists holding accountable these candidates for what we see, the tea leaf reading or whatever, what we see that they're doing. And too many, I think, we get into the silly season of elections and somehow you're not allowed to criticize one or the other. You're not allowed to look at things objectively anymore. Yeah. We're not going to do that at The Prospect. I mean, we're going to basically tell it like it is. We're going to support things that we think are good, and we're going to talk about things that we think are bad. And I think you have to have no fear or favor in these instances.
Well, look, as I said at the top of this episode, I really so appreciate that and your journalism and your work at the American Prospect. Just one last question, if I may. You just said, you pointed out, I think very rightly, that when Barack Obama's name wasn't in the ticket and his charisma wasn't in question, Democrats did very poorly. And God bless Democrats if they hope to have the party carried on the shoulders of Kamala Harris's Riz. God help us all. But I do think that Tim Waltz is kind of a different sort of a question here. And I do wonder what you make of his choice and some of the remarks he's been giving recently. He was just at the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees convention, and some clips were going around where he was saying some very strong pro-union statements.
Vice President Harris and I have both had the privilege of joining workers on the picket line. And it's why, as governor, I signed one of the biggest packages of pro-worker policies in history into law. In Minnesota, we made it easier for workers to form unions. We strengthened workers' protections. And yes, we banned those damn captive audience meetings for good in Minnesota. Last time I said that at a union meeting, they sued me over it. It was the best thing to get sued over I ever said. We're going to continue to ban those meetings.
And I think there's been some optimism around him and his kind of pro-worker record because of what he's done in his home state. And I do wonder if you think there is good cause for optimism there, or if ultimately he's a VP. And as we've seen from Kamala Harris, VPs don't really do anything anyway. Yeah. And the vibe shift is just a mirage.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we have to have that perspective that it's only a VP, but it is another data point, right? We don't have a lot of decisions from Kamala Harris, and this is one of them. And Tim Walz would be the first union member on a major party ticket as a president or vice president since Ronald Reagan, actually, who was actually in the Screen Actors Guild and was the head of it. He was the head of the Screen Actors Guild for a while. Walz would be the first. He is the first non-lawyer on a Democratic ticket since Jimmy Carter. Since Jimmy Carter. So for 44 years, we have had the professional managerial class lawyers running the Democratic Party. And here's a guy who was a school teacher, who was in the National Guard and then rose through the ranks of politics. I think that is interesting. I think that's good. He obviously was someone who was willing to sign pretty good policy when he was in Minnesota. The Minnesota situation is interesting. So they didn't have a majority, Democrats, in Minnesota for many years. And there was like a decade or more of pent up policy where, they wanted to do stuff, but either Republicans had a share of the state legislature or they had the governor's mansion. And in 2022, they finally get their trifecta, but it's by the barest of margins. 1 seat in the state Senate and only a few seats in the state House. And they put out this incredible mass of legislation that Walz ends up signing. And it's all really, really good. There's a great labor law there that bans non-compete agreements. It bans captive audience meetings. He does family and medical leave. He does investments in childcare, investments in long-term care. He did a renewable energy standard. So 100% of energy in Minnesota will be renewable by, I think, 2035. There just a whole host of policies. And he was part of a coalition that put that together, though. I mean, it wasn't like he ran on that and then that's what happened. There was, really.
I did see the left saying that he was really pushed as well, and that there was a robust kind of DSA and organized left. Yeah.
It was a bottom-up movement, including faith groups. I mean, it's actually a really interesting story what happened in Minnesota to get a progressive coalition into government and then to pass this policy by one vote, right? I mean, they had to have every Democrat support it, no matter where they came from and what their ideology was in the state. So, I mean, I think that's to the good. I think there are a lot of things to like about Walz. Ultimately, yeah, he's a vice president. You don't expect his policy to be at the top. Harris has said that she's intimated that she's kind of interested in these parts of this Build Back Better agenda that didn't pass, the care economy stuff mainly, like the child tax credit, which they also passed in Minnesota, by the way. The child tax credit, the child care, pre-kindergarten, universal pre-K, paid family medical leave, those kinds of things. I think that's going to be a big part in the first year of what Harris probably is going to try to accomplish. And she sees someone in Tim Walz who passed all of that at the state level with a very thin majority, which is what, if Harris gets in, she will have. She will probably have no more than 50 votes in the U.S. Senate. And she sees like a mirror in what happened in Minnesota. And if that's what she wants to do, she thinks he can be a good partner there. He also spent 12 years in the House and knows everybody in the House. So I think it was a good pick. I think also for, we don't want to talk about vibes too much, but for the vibes, to pick him over Josh Shapiro was probably a good thing.
Yeah, look, the vibes are immaculate.
Exactly.
The vibes are immaculate. The question is, are the vibes meaningful? And right. I think that's what's been really difficult in covering this stuff. It's that, like, I don't want to seem like a scold who's indifferent to the, I think, collective relief that the whole country felt when Biden stepped down. I don't want to seem uncredible or like blind to the reality of that kind of psychic shift that exists.
And if you see it up close, by the way, like when I was in Las Vegas watching that, there were 16,000 people in line in 109-degree heat to get into this arena. They actually had to turn people away because it was a health hazard of having them wait in line. To see the joy, like the relief, I think relief is the really the operative phrase here. It's palpable. You can really feel it. You could feel that energy. And Democrats feel like they don't have to look with dread, but they're kind of projecting a lot of their hopes and dreams onto Kamala Harris. She's kind of become kind of a vessel for what people think they want out of politics. And that can be dangerous because Obama was that way too. And I don't know that he delivered that.
Exactly. I think that's the exact right point. And I am so grateful that people like you are out there, people who held Obama to account and who are still doing it now with Kamala Harris and trying to help the general public learn from the lessons of the past so we don't have to repeat them. Thank you so much for joining me here today, David.
All right. Thanks very much.
Do you want to plug anything or let people know where they can find you and your work on the internet and beyond?
Sure. Prospect.org. We will have, we do a magazine 6 times a year, print magazine that you can purchase. But we're also on the web every day, writing about politics and policy and power. And I'm still on X, such that it is at Dayen, DDAYEN.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening. If you want an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast every week, you can subscribe at patreon.com/Bad Faith Podcast. And I strongly recommend reading The Prospect if you don't already. The real news is really important. And I say that as someone who gives commentary. We really wouldn't have anything to talk about without reporters like Dayen and the rest of the folks over at The Prospect and elsewhere. So please do offer your support. Take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.